Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon for those of you on the West Coast. Good evening for those of you in other time zones. I'm delighted to see you all, and I'm grateful that you have joined us for this very special event. I want to say first that this event is being recorded and will be made available on the Center for Medical Humanities website in the near future. I want to thank the deans of the Schools of Medicine, Humanities, and the Claire Trevor School of the Arts for their support of the center, as well as members of the community whose support has been so critical and uplifting. Thanks to the Mellon Foundation, whose Sawyer Seminar made this and other events possible over the past 2 years. And I also want to thank the center staff for their excellent work in making today's and all of our events possible. So thank you, Sam Carter, Joanne Jamora, and Amanda Swain. Thank you to the three of them for making this year so full of meaningful events. Please go to our website to view all of the events the center hosted this year. I trust that you were able to view this exquisite film. Thank you to Anne and Jin for making it available for us at UCI to watch it. And my understanding is that this is the university premiere, so we're very, very honored that you allowed UCI to view it first. For those in the audience, if you've not been able to view it yet, or if you'd like to share opportunities for others to view it, Manzanar Diverted will have its East Coast premiere as part of the Film Fest DC Justice Matters series from June 9th to June 13th. Go to filmfestdc.org to buy tickets to screen the film and to let others know about it. And that link is in the chat. Let me briefly introduce today's panelists and then we can get started. Kathy Jefferson Bancroft is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Lone Pine Paiute Shoshone tribe. She attended Stanford University, Fort Lewis College, and Montana State University, where she studied organic chemistry, cell biology, and neuroscience, and she completed a PhD, so she's clearly smarter than all of us in this room. She works with the Alabama Hills Stewardship Board to seek protection of tribal lands. She's on the Cultural Resources Task Force for the Owens Lake Dust Mitigation Project and the Owens Lake Master Project Advisory Group. She works with groups to fight the destruction of native sacred spaces. Independent filmmaker Anne Kaneko, who's the director and producer of Manzanar Diverted, is known for her personal films that weave her intimate aesthetic with the complex intricacies of political reality. Kaneko poetically probes the intersection of where power impacts the personal, and her films include A Flicker in Eternity, Against the Grain, An Artist's Survival Guide to Peru, Overstay, and 100% Human Hair. She graduated with an MFA in film directing from UCLA and currently teaches media studies at Pitzer College. Jin Yukim, who is the producer and impact producer, is a Korean Bolivian American filmmaker. She is the impact producer of Try Harder and co-produced a woman's work, The NFL's Cheerleader Problem. She co-produced K-Town 92 and served as the digital engagement impact strategist for Waking Dream, a PBS digital series, and Blowing Up. She is a Sundance Producing Fellow and was a Firelight Media Impact Producing Fellow. She has an MFA in film from USC and a BA from Wellesley College. Today's panel will be moderated by Nule, who is Associate Professor of English Literature at the University of South Florida. She specializes in critical ethnic studies, settler colonial studies, critical refugee studies, Asian American literature and film, Native American indigenous literature and film, and theories of affect and embodiment. Her work has appeared in interdisciplinary journals such as Amerasia Journal, the Journal of Asian American Studies, and Dance Chronicle. She is the author of Unsettled Solidarities, Asian and Indigenous Cross-Representations in the Americas, published by Temple University Press in 2019, which won the Association for Asian American Studies Literary Criticism Book Award this year. Thank you to my esteemed panelists for joining us, and thank you for this event. New?
Good afternoon, everybody, and good evening to everybody in the East Coast. First, I would like to thank Jim for inviting me to moderate this incredible panel. I'd also like to thank Joanne and Sam for all their wonderful technical support. And then finally to Anne, Jin, and Kathy for bringing this wonderfully multi-layered and generative film to life. I am incredibly honored to be here and to be in dialogue with all of you. So before I ask my first questions, I would like to say a few words about the film and what I see as three key contributions that the film makes in both engaging and expanding dialogue, particularly across Asian and Indigenous communities in the Americas. So first, through its emphasis on the history of water in the Owens Valley, or Payahuunadü, the film illuminates the cross-community connections that the settler state invokes and yet elides in its machinations for control of indigenous lands and waterways. So by centering the multiple violences and displacements that impact the Paiute Shoshone peoples, Nikkei communities, and other local residents in the Owens Valley, the film engages settler colonialism and racialized violence in the United States, not as separate or confined structures or events, but as co-constitutive with one another. Second, by connecting these often separately discussed communities and their present histories, the film brings to the surface the converging, if not shared, lexicon or language employed by Asian and Indigenous communities in their experiences with and critiques of the racialized settler colonial state. So the converging vocabulary that is used to describe the actions of the state invokes a kind of epistemology of place that unsettles perceived understandings of time, tense, and the intensities of state violence. So for example, in the film, right, I see the use of terms such as concentration camp to identify Nikkei internment, or the use of the term dust bomb to describe the implementation of the aqueducts. These uses of these particular words work to heighten and to expand our senses to the scales, the timeframes, and the intensities of violence that may otherwise not be registered within preconceived notion of what constitutes as an event of harm. So that the dust bomb, right, created by the LADWP atones us to both the spectacular as well as the slow violence produced for the sustenance of a megalopolis 200 miles away. Calling it a dust bomb then helps us to think about the manifold scales through which harm can be enacted within and across communities. Third and lastly, because I want to, provide enough time to hear from our panelists, I just want to illustrate, or I just want to highlight how the film illuminates how this cross-racial dialogue and shared lexicon across differently situated communities in the Valley glimpses at the actuality of and potential for what scholar Tiffany Lethabel King describes as, quote, a truly ethical encounter, a kind of co-witnessing that enables people not only to mirror back pain, but also to implicate one another in our survival. So this is seen best in the film, I feel, in the overlapping memory practices by both Nikkei and Indigenous communities in the area. So from the pilgrimage to Manzanar to the commemorative run that is featured in the film suggests that it is precisely these embodied memories and practices and the co-witnessing that occurs across communities and generations that bespeaks the failure of state strategies to, and this is a quote directly from the film, right? The state's strategy to, quote, outlive those who remember, end quote. So it is with these three key contributions in mind that I also formed the questions for today. So really just the first question that I wanted to ask was to begin by asking Anne, first of all, how you came to making the film, and then to ask Jin and Kathy how you both came to being involved in the project. And then connected to that question, I'm just wondering if you all can speak to what your goals were for the project at its initial stage and how these goals changed during the filming and the editing.
Oh, so many questions. Well, thank you, Nu. It's a real pleasure to be here. I really, would like to thank UCI, Jim, and the staff for putting this together. I will want to acknowledge that this film would not be here if it were not for Jim. And actually, before I start, I just wanted to acknowledge also that I am zooming in from Los Angeles, but really this is the unceded lands of the Tongva and the Chumash and others, so also known as Los Angeles. But yes, this film began when Jim actually invited me to be on this humanities project to look at Manzanar in sort of this interfaith, intercultural way. And I thought, what do I have to add to this conversation, since so much work has already been done about Manzanar, right? And, I think that as a Japanese American filmmaker, I also have the burden of really, okay, if I'm gonna go down this path, I really need to make this a statement that's new. There have been so many amazing films around this experience of incarceration for my community. And so I was determined to find a different way of looking at this, right? And so when I came to Manzanar, I was interested really in looking at the land, this place where Japanese Americans were forced removed to, throughout the country. But, Manzanar kind of gave me the possibility of looking at this place that, I also knew had connections to Native American communities. And obviously everywhere in the United States is indigenous land, but these histories overlapped, and even more so, I think, at Poston and Gila River, which, one Gila River is on tribal land that you must get acknowledgement from the tribe in order to visit now. Poston also, they created water infrastructure to allow people, for the Japanese American community to be there. So anyway, all of these things, I think, when I realized that these histories of water and Native American history, Japanese American history, all converged in this place, I thought, well, what a great opportunity to look at these things. And so I think that's sort of how this film came about. And especially the story of water, growing up in Los Angeles, I realized that that I was not clear really about how we got our water. And so that's why, if I didn't realize that history or understand that history, then I figured other people probably also didn't. And so I thought that this was a way that many different people who were aware of different strands of this history could enter and sort of see the connections in this much larger panorama. So I think that's kind of how this film came to be. And in terms of my objectives, this film started as a short film. I think it was more of maybe a history project. I feel like, Jim is here. He can also talk about the evolution of this film, and sort of from his perspective can see how it evolved. But it was kind of this fulfillment for this humanities project, but it was like, oh my gosh, it seemed like there was so much more potential to really explore these things up until the present. And so then it just grew and grew and grew. And it became this, over a 5-year process to make this film. And I think that the research also just grew and grew and grew. And so, it became more ambitious, especially as, Jin helped to support a film that had a more sort of ambitious, ambitious goals in terms of reaching people. But yeah, I can't remember if am I leaving anything else out?
Jin or Kathy, would you both like to also kind of speak to how you came to being a part of the film?
Sure. I was curious what Jim was gonna say about that trip, that initial trip, and also how you think about the film, like the result, like you were there at the beginning and now you're here at the end. So I'm curious.
Yeah, I feel like this is a great opportunity to ask Jim a question, since I know you've seen it from afar and now you're here. It's here. Oh, you're muted.
The original project that I was part of was looking at sites of pilgrimage and kind of sacred spaces in that sense. And I pitched to our team of using Manzanar as a potential site to kind of think about how Manzanar is kind of simultaneously for Japanese Americans kind of a profane and sacred space at the same time. But in the lead up to that, several members of the team had other contacts in the area, and you know, it was those initial conversations in those first few days where I think kind of brought Anne into this much more intersectional understanding of this land than we had initially conceived. And so while our team looked specifically at the Manzanar pilgrimage and kind of very creatively followed these other leads. And so I think really importantly, really exceeded what we had kind of initially conceived of in our project. And so I think the result of that is, and then talking to Kathy, and then later in the process, bringing Jen into the process to make this truly multi-layered story. I mean, I think if she had just stuck to what we were conceiving, it would not nearly be as complex and moving a film as it is.
I guess I'll jump in real quick. And hello, I am Jin. I'm also from Los Angeles, the land of Tongva, Chumash, and Kitch. And I joined this project without really at first feeling a personal connection to the project, because I'm Korean. And although like I identify myself as Asian American, I wasn't like yet formally feeling, I guess, like I understood any of my Asian American history or my place in the US, because I'm also like first generation immigrant child. So yeah, like when Anne first contacted me to produce this, at first I just didn't really consider myself an environmentalist. I didn't really see too much of a connection. But after I read her treatment, I immediately just like felt moved to do something about it. Like that feeling of like wanting to take action, and that feeling of like, how could we live not knowing these connections? Like that slight anger and desire to do something I knew was going to be at the core of this like mission, like of the impact campaign, right? Like most people who live in Southern California, I don't think they know the full story of where their water comes from, nor do they know like what kind of stories those lands tell, right? And how these histories intersect. Even people who are very knowledgeable about the Manzanar concentration camp history don't all know that that's Los Angeles's watershed, right? So all of these things, I felt like, why are we only hearing like one little piece of history? Why are we not being presented with the full story? And so I thought that was like such an incredible opportunity for us to educate Californians, and to also like see if there was any way to have a shift in paradigm. Maybe we could build an impact campaign around that. Maybe there's like a blueprint of like how Los Angeles decides to push forward that could be used by other megalopolis. I don't even know how to say that word, right? Like other cities like that have similarly extractive relationships with other communities. And then as we were finishing this film, you know, the increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans also made us kind of really think about, wow, this has always happened to many communities, and Asian American communities have also suffered through this before. Let's look at like, what are these like xenophobic fears? Like, how is this also like kind of the similar fears that the government used to enact racist policies to really just like, you know, uproot whole communities and put them behind bars, and how that's happening to so many different communities. So I just feel like, sadly and unfortunately, this story, which is like a lot of it is rooted in the past, like it is also like kind of commenting on what's happening now and like how it could look in the future if we don't do something about it.
Thank you so much, Jin. And Kathy, can you speak a little bit about your involvement in the project?
Okay. Well, I first became involved with this project when Anne called me up one day and said, "Can I interview you?" And so I met her at Manzanar and did a little interview with her, and it was really interesting. And I went about my way and thought that I was done. I did what she asked and didn't think a whole lot about it. And then she came back and says, "Can I interview you some more?" And I really liked the questions she asked me. They weren't, you know, a lot of people ask you questions that they, you know, they want a certain answer, but Anne's questions were more thought provoking. And I felt free to talk about what I wanted and, you know, and things that I normally don't get asked and get to talk about. So it was kind of fun. So she kept calling back to do some more, and okay, and it became really interesting. And pretty soon, then she'd disappear for a while, then she'd come back and okay, now I need character development. And I'm like, well, you don't need me. Yeah, I do. And I don't even know what character development is because I've never been that involved with the film. And so, yeah, 5 years later, I didn't realize, but I saw several different versions of the same film, and every time it just got better. And it's an amazing story, and I know the story, and I know everybody in there, but the way she tells it is really inspirational, and I'm really proud of it. Glad to be a part of it.
Thank you so much. So the second question I have is kind of connected to what I'd mentioned in the introduction. So I feel like I think everybody would agree that the film does such a wonderful job of providing a nuanced rendering of how Asian and Indigenous communities, right, our histories and our presences are bound up with one another. So I was wondering if you all could speak a little bit to why you think that these communities, and you know, I think that Anne and Jin, you had mentioned this in terms of there hasn't really been much talked about in regards to sort of these cross connections in Manzanar, right? And so this is kind of something that up until now, there's very little in terms of these discussions. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to why you think these communities are often registered as disconnected from one another, and what you think are the possibilities you see, right? The possibilities for social justice, for sustainable environments, for, you know, collectivizing towards Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. So what possibilities do you see when we come to understanding our histories and our presences relationally in the way that you have done in this particular film?
I guess I'll start. I guess, you know, when I was thinking about this film earlier on, I think that there was a lot of discussion, you know, around with the Muslim ban in particular. There was this talk of, you know, it's always looked at, the Japanese American experience is sort of looked at as the precedence for something like the Muslim ban. But then I thought, no, really the precedence is what happened to Native Americans in this country and how they were forced removed from their homelands. and you know, that as well as slavery, really African American slavery. But I think that in the context of this film, it was easier to see these parallels of Native American displacement and Japanese American displacement, and I felt like, well, we need to understand what these bigger connections really are. I mean, I feel like with what's going on in the Middle East right now in terms of Israel and Palestine, if we want to open up a can of worms, it's about land. And it's again about forced removals. It's again about people's sovereignty and, you know, connections to homeland. And so I think that these stories have resonances everywhere. You know, historically, they're really, they are at the essence of how our societies are built and countries are made, and the kind of racism and, you know, the colonization that happens in the name of, you know, people who want power over other people or people who want other people's lands. I think all of those things converged in this place, and it felt like, oh, well, here we can talk about these much bigger issues through what was happening here. And so I think that, yes, it definitely is a way to look at, you know, Asian American and indigenous experiences in sort of the same space. But hopefully it really helps people to see these broader connections through many, many communities in terms of, you know, how our state has really instituted these racist policies, and how resource extraction and, you know, moving people is really also in the name of, you know, power and greed. It's funny, I've been reading my daughter Obasan, which is a novel by Joy Kogawa, and it's about the Japanese Canadian incarceration experience, or not incarceration, but sort of experience during World War II. And that book I had forgotten. I'd read it as a child, or, you know, much younger. I wasn't a child when I read it, but, you know, she clearly places these Native American experiences and the Japanese Canadian experiences together, because she was in a community with indigenous folks. And so I feel like there are these intersections because there are, both communities have such deep connections to land and to our environment. So.
Thank you so much, Anne. Jin or Kathy, do you have a response as well?
I mean, everything Anne just said, and also I keep, you know, as we were making this film, like I was constantly surprised at seeing like more and more connections, even though I shouldn't be surprised at that point. Just doing research, like coming upon like Fort Sill, right? Like this was like infrastructure that was built to really imprison Geronimo and women and children, that was then recycled to imprison like Japanese Americans during World War II. And it's being recycled again, and unaccompanied minors like have been housed there. So it's like, when is this building going to be destroyed? You know, like, why are we keeping it, right? And it's like, and it's not even just that, but that is like kind of a tangible and visual way of thinking about how these structures existed throughout time to like really just like exclude people, incarcerate people. And, you know, we just kept seeing these kinds of connections. Like when we were in Fort Missoula in Montana, and Anne's grandfather was incarcerated there. And, you know, that fort was also used to fight against Native Americans before Japanese Americans were incarcerated there. So there's like all these like sites that continue to stand and continue to be recycled. And so it's just like a visual metaphor of just seeing how like things haven't changed too much, and it could constantly be used to displace different communities. And the more people are aware that these places exist, and the more people can like point to it as examples, I think people just need to be more educated by it, because I think once you're educated, you'd be angry and you'd want to do something about it. And it is truly like this paradigm shift that we're trying to call for. Yeah, Kathy.
I don't know where to start, but I was so wrapped up in what you guys were saying. But no, I just see there's just that interwoven what Anne talks about in the story, because our stories are so intermingled, and you might not notice that, um, but I keep thinking about, when they built the whole concept of the internment camps, and when they built Manzanar, they used the model that was set up by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to deal with the native tribes in this country. And so the whole thing has included us. We were kicked off the land. They brought in the Japanese that they wanted to. A lot of the indigenous people worked there, or even became friends with the people incarcerated there and helped them, brought them food and stuff. And even years later, just the partnership we have with the Manzanar Committee, how they've helped us with environmental issues around here, and we remain really good, close friends. I've been involved with the pilgrimage every year for a lot of years, and it's just fascinating to me. And how, even though we have different stories, kind of, they're still so similar. And the more I learn, the more things keep coming back to me. I think I'm going off here, and here's a story that I can relate to. And I've met a lot of people at Manzanar, and I just happened to sit next to a lady one time, and she was incarcerated up in South Dakota, I think, one of the camps up there. And they got out, but her father was one that was sent to the prison camp a long ways away. And so they had to wait for him. So they actually had a house and everything. And it's an amazing story, and how they lived up there, and they got to know the tribes near there. And when her father finally got to come and join them, he came. She told me the story about how he went to the store one night, and he came back, and he said, as no matter how hard we had it, the Indian people in this country had it harder. And when her parents got older, they lived in the Bay Area, and they actually lived like 2 blocks away from my son. And they started scholarships for Native American students in this country. And when they died, they left a big endowment for Native. And I was just totally amazed. It's how our stories come together. And when you watch this film, you can see where that comes from. And very similar. It's nice to have friends that understand.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all. So, I mean, all of you are mentioning, this overlap, right, that's occurring in terms of these, particularly what struck me was what, Jin, you were talking about in terms of, these actual sites or these actual structures, right, that have been used over time, right, to incarcerate communities. And one thing that you had mentioned was, why isn't it that these are knocked down, right? Which is really interesting if we juxtapose that to one of the points of the film in terms of highlighting memory making or commemoration practices. And so one of the questions I have is about a comment that was made in the film about how one of the strategies of the state was to outlive those who remember the history of the place. Right. And I think some folks have also mentioned how the trees remember, as well as the mountains have stories. right? And so there is this kind of necessity to sort of open ourselves up to kind of hearing the memories of the place beyond just human stories as well, right? And so place itself can tell these particular stories. So I'm wondering if, you know, I'm one of the questions I have is if you all can talk a little bit more about the impact of these commemorations, right? So, you had mentioned the Manzanar pilgrimage as well as the commemorative run, um, um, for community building particularly. How do you see the film itself also as taking part in these forms of commemoration or memory making for you?
Should I start? You know, I will mention we're actually planning a series of screenings in Payahuunadü for the beginning of July. And we are doing this to sort of coincide with a commemoration of the forced removal at the beginning of July. So I guess that, correct me if I'm wrong, Kathy, but that date, well, the date of this event is July 11th, which I believe was also the same. It was right around there. So I think it is important, and I mean, I feel like, I don't know. I mean, I shouldn't say this, but in some ways, I guess growing up, I had been a little skeptical maybe of these kinds of events. You know, my parents would always want to go to these camp reunions and things. But it is important, and it's really important to see communities come together. It's an opportunity to remember those things. So, I mean, I don't know. And I think that, you know, it's so interesting to think about like markers as well of these histories, right? I think Manzanar, since it has that obelisk, is very, you know, I think a lot of people, it has a lot of symbolism. Well, I guess I mentioned this in this moment when, you know, in terms of the South, there's, you know, tearing down of this Confederate history and monuments. And I think it's important to acknowledge sort of, you know, real histories that happen there, and to sort of gather around those things. I mean, as I was creating that, or, you know, filming that part of the, you know, trying to commemorate that run, it was like, you know, it shocked me to see that the things that were memorializing that history were so broken down, you know, that the sign was, you know, sort of in shambles, and it, you know, and of course the folks, especially from Fort Independence, who said it was like, oh, well, you know, that's not important. It's the story around it that's important, which I agree. But if that's the way that people connect to it, then it's sort of like, oh, it seems like that should also be, you know, have a bigger presence. But I don't know. I don't know quite what else to say. I would love to hear what Kathy or Jen have to say about this.
I'll add to that because, yeah, we do these commemorations, or, you know, pilgrimages, whatever, so that it's not forgotten. And history has to be taught for people to understand, for us to know who we are, why we are the way we are. And I think about just recently, I've been watching this. It's tragic, but also kind of interesting, about the 215 children they found in a mass grave, you know, at one of these residential schools. And just the response it got from all these people, that I can't believe that happened, and this is terrible. And yeah, it is. But to me, I've known this for years. It didn't surprise me at all. You know, most of my life, I know my father attended one of these schools. That same, you know, it's that, um, I I was asked to speak at a thing about the migrant children who were locked up in these things. And I was like, oh, I really don't have anything to say, but if I think of something, they said, come on up. So I did get up there and I said, people think, you look and here's an instance where these children are locked up. But I came from a family who my father was taken away for his whole entire childhood, wasn't allowed to come home. And that, yeah, it affected him, and that's obvious, but it affects me. It affected the way I grew up, and it affects my children. It doesn't go away. It doesn't just affect those people. And so I've lived this, and then, so I'm totally amazed when people don't even know the history of the residential schools and stuff. So that's important. You have to know the history to know how to deal with it. But the other thing I see, and when we do the commemorative run, it's to acknowledge that this happened and to, because a lot of people don't realize that people were forced removed from here. 1,000 people in July, were forced to walk out of here and didn't make it. But I think what's more important is the story about my great grandmother and how she, as a little girl, found her way back to this valley by herself, and just to show the determination and the love for this place, by that act. And more importantly, when you have all of these people who are descendants of these people that were on the walk, and reminding us that this is why we're here, because of us and the resiliency of our people, that it's almost more of a celebration and makes you appreciate who you are. And that's what we like to focus on. And I see the same thing of the pilgrimage, and it's just only grown to the people and all the different people and backgrounds that can relate to us, because it shows that other people went through what you did and we're still here. And I think that's the most important message.
Thank you so much. So there are several questions from the attendees, and so I'd like to give some time for the questions themselves. So one of the questions is from A. Naomi Paik, who writes, could you speak more to how the land and the environment itself sheds light on the shared histories and collective memory beyond commemorative acts or rituals created by communities of people? So thinking of the water and the solar infrastructure inflicting violence on the land and environment and on collective memory. She also adds that the film is beautiful, and thank you so much for the event as well.
Jen, do you want to try?
I think I can speak a little bit to just kind of this idea that green energy is like without any like bad. And yeah, of course, like if you have like solar panels in smaller scale, like on your roof or whatever, like it's great to shift, energy sources. But when you're thinking about like solar farms and like the infrastructure that is required to make that happen, you do need like a large amount of land and all the, I mean, Kathy, I know you can speak to the like intricacies and details of this more, but people like forget that like all of these technological solutions come at the cost of communities and people and land that who live there. And then, we recently ran into like the whole like Bitcoin NFT situation as well. Like people just like, it's like this invisible, like new way of doing things. And it's like, yeah, but all the infrastructure required to like mine these things and all the energies that go into it, like people aren't thinking about environmental waste, because you just assume anything technological is like forward thinking and it's good for the world and, it's good for the environment, but it's not always the case. And so I just feel like sometimes people resort to technological advances to solve like age-old problems, but really like why not look towards like indigenous solutions, right? And how indigenous people have been doing it for a long time before a lot of these like technological advances have come. So it's just asking people to shift again, like their focus and ways of doing things. Like, why are we assuming technological advances are better? Like, what is the root of that, right? And then I guess like the other part of the question is of like the environment and the trees. I mean, like in the film, like the trees are like witnesses to everything that have happened, right? They're like telling their story by the way that they have hung on or have disappeared. I recently met like a 150-year-old grapefruit tree in Little Tokyo that has been there through like the Great Depression, the incarceration of Japanese Americans, you know, like the 92 upraising, just like, and that tree has outlived so many people. And like, so just thinking about how we as humans are not the only living beings here. We're not the only ones who bear witness to a lot of these things. Like, of course, like if we have generations of people from one community, we're able to hold on to those stories ourselves. But yeah, thinking more broadly about like our environment and, you know, what can a tree tell us? Yeah, I don't know. Kathy, I think you have a lot more to say about this.
Yeah, that connection to the land is so central to the whole story, because we are a part of this land. You know, this land is who we are, and I talk about that in the film. I'm pretty sure I watched it too many times, but I when I look around, and I always tell people this, I feel really special and I'm really thankful because I'm living in the land where my ancestors have lived for thousands and thousands of years, you know. And when I look outside every day, I see the same view that my ancestors looked at every day. And I'm realizing just how special that is. I always knew that, but I'm finding a lot of people, you know, just have no concept of that. And like I talked to my grandmother coming back in their stories, how many times did they try to remove us from this land? Said, no, we're not going in, we're dying here because our families are here and we're not leaving. And it's that strong tie to this place. There's, you know, I can look at every mountain and have a memory of walking up there or down by the creek, you know, or stories that I've been told from my families of things happening here. You have that knowledge, and it really describes of who you are as a person, and you can't trade that for anything. And I think if people had a better connection, they wouldn't be doing these things like these huge industrial solar farms that, oh, well, it's just 4 square miles of land that we're going to tear up, you know, and destroy and put this toxic waste on and everything. We wouldn't have, right now we're under huge threat from mining exploration. They want to put gold and lithium mines everywhere that just completely tear down mountains and make heaps of soil that they can leach with cyanide. And they act like we're crazy because we're like, you can't do that, you know. We live here. There's not an endless supply. This is who we are. We depend on this for livelihood, for survival, because and it shows because we lived here for thousands and thousands of years, and the environment was all the better for it. And I tell that to LADWP, you've only been here for a little over 100 years, and you've almost destroyed this valley. You can't, water is not endless, you know, but if you take it all, you're killing not only us, but you're killing yourself because you won't have it either. So it's really important that people start understanding how important these resources are and how to better take care of it by, just like Jim said, you know, going back and look at how was it taken care of in order to, it's obviously not what we're doing today. So I think.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Jin. So I'm gonna move on to another question from an attendee. So Wendy Cheng says, thank you for this wonderful film. And Cheng asks, What would you like to see the city of LA and LA residents do today to better recognize and respond to these histories and its ongoing extractive relationship with this land and its peoples?
I think that should be Kathy responding.
I knew you were going to say that. No, that's what, especially when I talk to groups of people from LA, I remind them that, you know, we're up here, we're basically a resource colony. We have, even though LADWP owns most of this land, even Inyo County doesn't have say over most of what they do. We can sit up here and jump up and down and scream and holler, and they just look at us like going, okay, that's cool. And they act like they're listening, but they really don't have to do anything because they own the land and they think they own the water. But in LA, you know, you people down there have the right and you vote for these people. You know, maybe not the LADWP employees, but they vote for their city commissioners and no, is that no, the city council, that's what they're called, you know, and the mayor, you know, they're all voted for, and they hold the political power down there, which is huge because anything that LADWP is owned by the city, and they have to approve everything they did. If nobody notices, these stuff just go through and are passed without any kind of discussion or anything. If people become educated down there in the city on these issues and learn what's going on, and if something important is coming down the line, they can say, tell their city councilman, you know, this needs to be addressed because you're affecting that whole valley up there. If issues come on a city council agenda for like 5 times and that's not addressed, it just automatically passes. So the people in LA have a lot of power, and they also have a lot of power to conserve and say, you know, up here they always use, well, we got the, you know, we got to make our ratepayers happy. What they don't say that when they spend $1 billion on something ridiculous, but if we want $3 million to pay to build a curation facility to get our ancestors back, to get our artifacts they've taken from this valley so that we could at least have them here at home, they act like it's a big deal and they got to prove it through the ratepayers. And to me, 3 million is a lot to me, but they spent 28 million to build a trail system, 3 small little trails out on the lake because they were required to, and they didn't bat an eye at that. So funding is always relative, but they're always using that excuse. So if the ratepayers really did say something and started raising heck about what they're doing, then maybe something would happen. You know, they do hold a lot of power down there. But I think the most important thing is just becoming educated. And, you know, and now they're trying to act like they're so green and they're doing all this water saving and they're not going to have to buy water because we're doing all this stuff in LA to recycle and everything, which is good. And it's great that the city of LA and the people there are working on this. And that should have been part of the deal for a long time. What they're not saying is that it's not, they're still taking as much or more water from our valley than they always have because that they don't consider it imported water or purchased water. It's their water. And so that isn't even part of the discussion. And they're not, if you're going to save water, let's talk about saving water and how you can help us up here too. And but they're not listening to us, but the people down there, I feel that they can make a difference. And we try up here too. And sometimes we can do little things to convince certain people, but I think you can make big changes in LA.
I think also that LADWP hasn't really acknowledged, you know, the tribes and really being in conversation with them about better ways to approach these things. And, you know, these discussions around water, they're just, you know, they don't view them as a partner in this process, which they which they are and which they should be. So, but hopefully the film beyond Los Angeles also really gives people an awareness of how mostly metropolitan areas and agricultural areas are, you know, taking water from other areas for, you know, they're taking it without thinking about the impacts on the communities of that whose water they're taking, right? And that's not just water. So, and often this is sort of, you know, urban and rural relationships.
Thank you, Anne and Kathy. So there's another question from Catherine Benamou. Catherine asks, were you inspired at all by the work of Rhea Tajiri in History and Memory? And I think we're almost running out of time. So, but if somebody could speak to that.
I'll speak to that. Rhea is a dear friend of mine. And in fact, I invited her onto that first trip that we took to Manzanar, the Manzanar pilgrimage. And yes, History and Memory is an incredibly important film in my mind. I think it really opened and changed for me when I first saw it. I think it was very inspiring because it really resonated in how it portrayed this experience in a more sort of psychic and emotional way than a lot of films that, you know, are people's testimonials of what had happened. So yes, it's an inspiration, definitely. And Rhea herself has been an amazing advocate of this film, has continued to support the film throughout, you know, the process of making it. She's watched it many times. She has invited me to her classes to screen the film, and her students have given us feedback. So yes, she's a huge part of this film.
Thank you, Anne. So we have a couple more minutes left. And so I wanted to just kind of leave space for either Anne, Jin, Kathy, or Jim for last comments, or anything you'd like to say in terms of where folks might be able to kind of find more information about the film, or, you know, what's next with the film.
So we've put into the chat information about the film, the website, the film's website, the various social media feeds, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. You can sign up for their newsletter that come out to make announcements, or oftentimes Anne or Jin will kind of also make statements in light of current events. So you can keep abreast of that. And then again, later this week, at the East Coast premiere of Manzanar Diverted will take place. So you can go to filmfestdc.org to encourage people to buy tickets to view the film. I want to thank the panelists, Kathy, Jin, and Anne, for just your insights and your just continued wisdom and advocacy for making this film a continued living document. I want to thank Nu for your amazing moderation of this event, and for just being so perceptive and teasing out some of the major themes of the film. Thank you to our attendees, both who have stuck with us. Thank you for the attendees who had to leave early. This is the last event of the year, or the academic year, for the Center for Medical Humanities. So I just want to thank all of you for showing up, for persevering. I wish you all a restorative summer, so that even as we continue to be aware of what's going on in our world, we can also find things in our world that will sustain us for continued work and advocacy for all people, particularly communities, vulnerable communities. So so be well, stay safe, take care of yourself, take care of your loved ones, and be kind to others. Take good care. And thank you for joining us.